It's always difficult to speak about Gaza, and particularly more so now. I think part of the difficulty, of course, has to do with Gaza's inaccessibility, if I can call it that. It's difficult to actually get to Gaza and to get inside of Gaza. But part of that difficulty is also that I think Gaza often kind of pops up into global consciousness at times of heightened violence, like now, right? So it kind of perpetuates, if you want this kind of image, if you want that Gaza actually is destruction, ruination, dispossession, and so on. At the same time, I think it's important to speak about Gaza and to actually speak about the various sort of forms of destruction, dispossession that it faces. And so I just want to sort of thank you for that opportunity. And, maybe before I begin, I'll just kind of reiterate a point that I think always needs to be made, is that Gaza is obviously a central part of Palestine, whether as a political, cultural, or kind of moral entity. And so I don't mean to sort of sever it in any way, because I recognize that kind of, the severing or the cutting off of Gaza is part of a kind of ongoing Zionist project itself to fragment and to divide Palestinians from each other, to fragment and divide the land as well as Palestinians from the land. And I think that this severing and fragmentation and division between Palestinians, between each other, between them and their land takes place in part through the spheres of what we can call housing. And so I kind of wanted to start with the question of the infrastructure of housing in Gaza today. And let me see if I can try to share my, is it okay that you guys can see the stuff on the side over there? It's not in the way, is it?
Yeah, that's totally fine.
So I'm just going to sort of start with a quick question of what does it mean when a building or a house is actually destroyed in a place like Gaza? So if a bombing happens during the day, the death toll is going to be really high amongst women and children under school age, as well as the elderly, because that's who's usually at home most often. If it's during the night, it's not unlikely that a whole family is obliterated. And as we've seen in this war, I'm going to call it a war because I don't know what else to call it. But anyways, as we've seen sort of in the last 3 months in this war, and as we continue to see, entire family lines have been disappeared, killed, and obliterated. And this has actually everything to do with the infrastructure of housing. And as is common in certainly across Gaza, but I think in many other parts of the Arab world as well, an entire kind of extended family frequently lives in the same building. Okay, and so that buildings kind of grow as families grow. So once the eldest son is married, they build or you build up the sort of the next floor, and that's where he's going to end up living with his family. The next son will kind of do the same, and so as each of the sort of subsequent generations kind of begins to sort of form their own families, the buildings will kind of rise up at the same time, right? So that eventually you'll have the older generation lives on the bottom floor, and then each subsequent floor is kind of occupied by the next generation and the next generation and so on. And so the youngest are always kind of at the top. So when a building is collapsed and is bombed or is struck, and as I'll get to sort of a little bit later, what you see is necessarily the kind of the obliteration, if not the destruction of entire families. So part of the way to sort of think about it is that the destruction of a house is not simply obviously of a house, but also of entire kind of family lines. Let me see, I can't remember what I had. So, and if you kind of expand that to the realm of an entire kind of neighborhood or a part of a town. And as we've seen, and I feel like these kinds of charts are always kind of, they are out of date as soon as they're published because of the sort of continuous bombing and the continuous destruction that's been going on. But what we have seen over the past 3 months is something that's sort of astronomical in terms of the scale that we've never seen before, in terms of the amounts of houses and places, homes that have been destroyed over the last 3 months. So that's kind of very quickly sort of what does it mean to destroy a house? Similarly, I guess I could ask, what does it mean when telecom is destroyed or at least limited or shut down? And there's obviously, and so what it means when there's suddenly no communication as there has as has been the case for the past 5 days. I mean, this is from this morning, I think. Is, the first thing is, of course, there's no way for those of us on the outside to necessarily know what is happening within Gaza. But what also happens is that you can't, the documentation of whatever is happening is limited, and any sort of horrors, if you want, that are being committed, the world outside of Gaza might not necessarily sort of see them, right? So there's often these kind of posts that you see, for example, on social media of the sort of combination of the internet and telecom services are shut down, and at the same time these kind of massacres and bombings and so on are continuing, and there's a sort of lack of sort of knowledge or lack of documentation or archiving about these things. But I think it's important to also kind of reiterate that the prevention of communication is not just simply what happens between inside and outside Gaza, but also within Gaza itself, right? So between families, between neighbors, between families who are split up, those who end up going to different kinds of shelters, or those who have to flee. And so it becomes impossible, if you want, from within Gaza to actually know all sorts of information, notwithstanding the fact that there's no electricity, there's no fuel, the roads are largely sort of impassable, and so communication in a sort of physical realm is also very difficult. And so when the internet or when cell phone service is shut down, first responders don't know what's actually happening anymore. Ambulances can't be called. Hospitals don't know what's going on. And so what ends up happening is that paramedics and the civil defense team, like the people who are digging people up from under the rubble, instead actually have to just sort of listen for the explosions and then just sort of run in that direction, and to sort of imagine that somebody needs help in that realm. The other things that the shut off of internet and telecom kind of results in is also things like, people no longer know or can't check anymore and can't call in to the like UNRWA helpline to know when is their time to go pick up food or flour, and at sort of different distribution times, right? Or they might not know anymore what the list of evacuees at the Rafah border is, right? So there's all sorts of things that are kind of prevented, not just simply the communication kind of between the inside and the outside. And I just thought I'd sort of start with those two sort of examples, precisely to get at this point that the destruction of a house or the destruction of a communications network impacts obviously much more than its physical structure, but impacts various spheres of life. Because infrastructure, I think we can kind of imagine it as it is defined, if you want, by the movement or by the movement and by the possibility of social life. And so it is the living kind of mediation of what organizes the sort of life worlds that we exist in. And so one of the things that I thought I would kind of quickly try to address is, given the massive destruction that is happening, one of the issues that's kind of hard to sort of think through as the war kind of rages on is, how do we know what it is that we're going to rebuild once this is over? And it's both a kind of pessimistic question, but also a slightly optimistic question, right? On the one hand, I'm sort of assuming that destruction is going to continue, but I'm also assuming that there's going to be a point at which we are allowed to kind of rebuild. But of course, I think part of the thing to keep in mind is that what is evident for anybody who knows anything, if you want, about Gaza, is that the atrocious conditions that are being lived in today, while certainly worse than prior, that prior already was not the standard of living that we should actually hope to re-achieve. So that Gaza already before October had already exceeded this condition of unlivability. And that was a sort of conclusion already in 2012 of a UN report that Gaza by 2020 was no longer going to be a livable space. And so one way to precisely sort of think about what does it mean to have a livable space is to kind of go back and look at the question of infrastructure, and infrastructure as a relational or ecological process of sustaining kind of different sorts of life worlds. I know in the West, certainly a lot of people kind of are have continued to sort of theorize failure as a failure of infrastructure, as this moment when we begin to see infrastructure. But failure presumes something that is already, or at some moment was, working. And you have a number of infrastructure scholars, who suggest that when things stop working, they then threaten the sense of belonging or the sense of assembling, or as Lauren Berlant would have it, that movement is what distinguishes infrastructure from institutions, so that what constitutes infrastructure are these patterns, these habits, these norms, and these scenes of assemblage and use. But I don't think that the question of failure is actually very helpful in the context of Gaza, because in the context of Gaza, I think the question is more, what does it mean to be building, to rebuild, to produce, to reproduce any part of life, when it involves a kind of, when one is unable to move beyond destruction, beyond the knowledge of further destruction. Because Gaza has long faced an ever-ending, ever enlarging kind of stream of threats, whether they're military, whether they're economic, whether it's climate threats, ecological, social, political, hygienic, medical, nutritional. I mean, everything is a kind of threat and a crisis in Gaza. And all of these tend to sort of blur into one another. And so Israel has never had sort of definite plans for the future of the Gaza Strip, except to actually maintain it in a sort of perpetually precarious situation, constantly kind of on the brink of collapse or on the brink of unlivability. And already way back in 1987, Sarah Roy dubbed Gaza as in a perpetual state of, she meant economic, but de-development. De-development as this process which undermines, and I'm going to quote her here, a process which undermines or weakens the ability of an economy to grow and expand by preventing it from accessing and utilizing critical inputs needed to promote internal growth beyond a specific structural level. And so when we think about development, I think it's actually helpful to think of when we think of infrastructure, not just economic development, I think it's helpful to kind of think of de-development as equally applicable to the question of infrastructure, as well as to questions of like poverty, of hunger, of loss of dignity, of grief, of claustrophobia, so that all of these, or de-development is more than just simply infrastructural or even economic, but it's part of the sort of life world that's been created for Gaza. And as you know, since 2006, Gaza has also existed in this state of restriction. And restriction here necessarily relates to the blockage and to the siege. But it's also a way to kind of forcefully socialize lowering of expectations. And so that's one way that I think we can sort of think about infrastructure as restricted, is that the expectations of what infrastructure is and what it's supposed to achieve and what it's supposed to do and how it relates to our life worlds is constantly kind of lowered. And so there exists this kind of sprawling, if you want, kind of system of oppression that Gaza exists with, and that's often kind of constructed into Gaza's territory. I think another way to sort of think of what Gaza has faced even before October is the wearing out, or the kind of the sustenance, if I can call it that, or a kind of Gaza being kept in a sustained perpetual state that kind of forecloses, okay, or what some will call a state of debilitation. And this happens through raids, through incursions, through enclosures, through ongoing massacres, and so on. And so restriction is kind of one end, if you want, but so is debilitation, this idea of kind of constantly keeping people and infrastructure itself sort of below a particular level. So let me quickly kind of go to the example of housing and maybe telecom again, or maybe I'll just stop at housing. So residential buildings, for example, in Gaza, kind of, as you see here, there's a sort of a number of different kind of ways that people build. Most of them are made out of concrete, sometimes with a combination of plaster. Only if you're able to sort of mobilize enough funds can you actually sort of improve your dwelling to kind of these sort of middle class sort of standards. Like maybe you have windows, maybe you have glass windows, and so on. And so out of necessity, partially, buildings in Gaza are kind of built with the sort of very bare essentials. Okay. And the majority of residential buildings are kind of known for being these sort of unfinished gray boxes of concrete, corrugated metal, and plaster. And they're obviously built to specifications that are far below basic international standards. And that's sort of one way to kind of think about something like restriction. But when I think of something like debilitation, I also think of how since 2014, the materials that are allowed into Gaza have been restricted. And this is, you may not be able to read this, and you don't necessarily have to, but this is kind of a snapshot of what is called or the process through which building materials are now allowed into Gaza since 2014, known as the GRM, the Gaza Reconstruction Mechanism, which was set up in 2014 as a kind of, temporary sort of agreement between the PA, the Palestinian Authority, between the PA, the Israeli government, and then various kind of UN agencies, right, which are sort of mandated to oversee the implementation of building and the GRM in something like Gaza. And so what you have is this incredibly kind of complex bureaucracy of how you're even allowed to import different kinds of materials into Gaza. So not only are you kept in this sort of state of lowered expectations, but even when you do want to try to build, you are faced with an incredible kind of restrictions, right? Which together increase this sort of form of debilitation. And another thing to kind of consider is, for example, or this is just sort of giving you a sense of some of the ways that some of these buildings are put or are erected or sort of put together. There's also been a housing shortage since the 2008-9 sort of incursion and war, which early on in 2008, 2009 kind of hovered at around like 7,000 housing units or Gaza was short 7,000 housing units. And the way housing units are calculated, it's estimated that, each housing unit is home for about 5.1, 5.2 people, okay? And so the shortage is initially triggered by population increase and then plans for sort of new instruction. But what you also kind of get over the course of time is that with continued kind of Israeli assaults and destruction, you actually have Gazans being left homeless again and again and again. And so after the 2014 war, for example, and another 13,000 housing units were destroyed. In May of 2021, another 60,000 units were destroyed. And so throughout this time, not only do you not have kind of reconstruction initiatives that are implemented, you also have an increasing kind of deficiency of housing, okay? And so already even before this past October war started, you're already kind of living in this state in which you don't have things like housing. And at the same time, they're being taken away. And at the same time, you have this sort of continued need, right? Because of population growth of something like 15,000 units a year are required for Gaza's population as it kind of grows. And so at last count, Gaza in early 2023 was already short about 120,000 units. And in this war, about 70,000 have been completely destroyed and another 300,000 have been completely damaged, right? So what that means is that you have more than 500,000 people who no longer have a home to return to. And so that cities in Gaza, if you will, are no longer kind of dwelt in the conventional sense. Instead, what you kind of see is a sort of collapse between the street, the block, the room, the living room, the inside and the outside of the house, so that domestic spaces themselves have become exposed, and that the relationship, if you want, between the internal and the external is completely distorted.